Good evening, and welcome to what is one of the high points of the European Middle Ages. We have been building up to this point over our discussions of the medieval revival and then over the time of medieval romance. We've talked about how Europe went through a dark age after the fall of the Roman Empire, and then another dark age after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, this time of Charlemagne. And then you have this 200 years of darkness, of Vikings and feudalism, and what looks like, again, the collapse of civilization. But human beings are very resilient. And so, again, after that collapse, you have a revival, an agricultural revolution, which leads to surpluses, which leads to the development of towns and trade, greater optimism, the time of the Crusades and pilgrimage. After this, you have a switch to a new form of literature. Instead of the great epic poems like Beowulf from the earlier Middle Ages, you have the development of a new literature, medieval romance. By romance, we mean the tales of King Arthur, of knights, of lords and ladies. These are tales of optimism, of knights going on quests, of seeking for adventure. It supposes a new attitude toward the world, a new attitude of optimism. That life is not just something to suffer your way through, but that life is a sort of quest and an adventure, something to go out, grab life by the horns, and see what you can make of it. And all of this is building to the high point of the Middle Ages when we look at some of the main accomplishments of the Middle Ages. So this will begin a three-part series when we look at what are some of the classic accomplishments of the Middle Ages and some of the ways they've left a lasting influence on us. This first one will be on the medieval cathedrals, the great monuments the Middle Ages have left behind. The next will be on the medieval universities, where we saw the development of our own university system that lasts even to today. And finally, on a new system of investigation, the Inquisitio, which is related to the Inquisition. Again, three important parts of the Middle Ages we will look at in this series, beginning with these cathedrals. And all of these concern this new spirit of optimism, of adventure, of seeing life as a quest. The universities, the quest for students for knowledge, but the cathedrals were their own kind of quest. And it was a quest built on a certain way of seeing the universe. Not just anyone could have built the cathedrals in any time period. On the contrary, the cathedrals were built once, in one time period, in one place in the world. Not because other places didn't have the technology, but because there was something in the medieval mindset, in their mental attitude, and their outlook on life that led them to undertake the building of the cathedrals, to see this as their great effort and task. That's what we want to look at today. First point that's worth making is, again, a comparison to the monasticism of the early Middle Ages. Now, we've said before, the monks work very well for a feudal society, but they're also based on this kind of older bit of almost even pessimism in some ways. The idea that they're building these strong buildings in their walls and buildings with very little windows. If you look at the monasteries, they can almost look like fortresses. In a sense, that's what they were. They were fortresses, not just to keep out the Vikings, but to keep out spiritual evils, at least in a symbolic sense. But even though they have a certain element of pessimism, there's also something monasteries are trying to be. Monasteries are trying to be a sort of heaven on earth. They're this attempt to create a perfect heavenly society with perfect relationships, where the monks live their life in careful religious life together, in unity with God and each other. There's a famous monk, Bernard of Clairvaux, we mentioned him in the Crusades, who gives a description of another monk gives a description of Bernard of Clairvaux's monastery. He says, as you went and looked at the monastery, the only sounds to be heard were the sounds of their brothers at work or the sound of their chanting, perfect harmony dwells. The brothers all get along. And as you watch the monks work from morning till night, they seemed a little less than angels, but much more than men. The idea is the monastery is this ideal place, an attempt to bring heaven to earth. But the monks are in the country. Now that's wonderful, but what's going to bring heaven to earth in the cities? Because times are now changing. You have again the rise of towns and trade. And so while monks are way out in the country, what's there bringing heaven to people living in the city? People in the city seem like they're left all alone. How do we bring heaven to the cities? How do we make sure people in the cities are not left out? Because remember, cities are dangerous places. They're places of greater crime, disease, anonymity, belonging. You don't know everybody, so you feel more alone. So how can you bring heaven, God, to people in the cities? That's what the cathedrals were trying to do. Cathedrals were trying to create a sort of heaven on earth, to do for the cities what the monasteries did in the country. And the cathedrals are very much a city phenomenon. If you look at them, you can see how this is in some ways very easily. First of all, they're insanely expensive. To build these cathedrals was the task of over 100 years and an insane amount of money. You would need huge donations. You would need merchants. You would need all the wealth that a city could produce to make that happen. What's more, you needed specialization, which only exists in the city, because it took highly specialized labor to build those cathedrals. Stonemasons, builders, glass cutters, and it took centuries. An architect who started building the cathedrals would begin knowing that he would die long before the cathedral he started was ever built. He would never live to see it finished. That is an insane amount of dedication to put into this. So let's look at a few main points of the cathedrals. First main point to make, cathedrals were the skyscrapers of their day. That is one of the great descriptions of them, these skyscrapers of their day. They would have towered over the entire city. Even today, when of course we've got much bigger skyscrapers, cathedrals are towering landmarks in their cities. This passion for height, to make them as tall as possible, is something we cannot underestimate. And it leads to the need to develop new technology to make them even taller. If you look at Charlemagne's cathedral at Aachen, you see the beginnings of this. It does look very Gothic in style, but not completely. There are no flying buttresses. It has some buttresses against the side, buttresses meaning supports, but those supports are directly attached to the walls. That limits how high you can build it. By the time you get to this time period in history, the year 1200, the 1100s, the medievals are determined to build even higher. And this means they need to invent a new kind of support, the flying buttress. The flying buttress allows them to build their cathedrals even higher. So they have to invent new kind of supports to do that. Now, they weren't trying to build them tall just for the fun of it. There was a specific purpose here. The point of building them tall was so that they could cut bigger windows out of the walls and allow more light to stream in. I am standing behind in an image of Sainte-Chapelle. Sainte-Chapelle, Paris, is one of the single most famous displays of stained glass in the whole world. As you look at these walls, you can see just how little actual wall space there is. Almost all the wall space is cut out for stained glass. This is one of their greatest accomplishments. To design a cathedral where you could cut out this much wall space and still have the little bit that's left support an enormously tall building and a heavy ceiling. This passion for stained glass to build as tall as possible, to let in as much light as possible, it's sometimes called more height, more light. The stained glass itself was insanely expensive. It could cost as much as the entire cathedral combined, but it was also an important part of the cathedral. The stained glass contained pictures from the Bible, pictures of the saints. It was designed to help people remember, to move them to devotion, to move them to want to pray. The pictures have even been called books for people who cannot read. You can't read? Look at the pictures on the walls. That tells the whole story right there. Stories from the Bible, stories of the saints. And what these cathedrals do is they bring a piece of heaven into the city. The stained glass lets in more and more light, symbolizing God's illumination, the divine light that enlightens everybody and transports a person to heaven. So when a person stepped from a busy medieval street into a cathedral, he was entering a new world. You have to imagine the noise of a medieval street, just like one of our cities would be. And then, going from the world of noise and business, stepping into the cathedral behind those thick stone walls, suddenly you're entering a new world. As the feeling of the stone floors beneath your feet, as light streams into the cathedral, the smell of incense wafts throughout it. As you hear the sounds of the priests of the church chanting their prayers, it's not just a pretty picture to look at. You can't appreciate this just looking at an image. Instead, you have to bring your whole senses to this and understand just the effect on a person from walking into this. The cathedrals offered a sort of unity out of complexity. To build these was an enormously complex task. They were not just incredible works of technology, but incredible works of organization. If you look at the symmetry and the mathematics that went into this and the balance and the proportion, medievals had a very strong sense of organization and order, and they brought this to the cathedral. In fact, it was very important to them that the cathedral be orderly and organized, not just for architectural practical reasons, but because, remember, to them, the cathedral was a way to bring a little bit of heaven to earth. In bringing a little bit of heaven to earth, they saw the world as orderly. The world was organized, and they wanted this reflected in the cathedral, a place of order and organization, all pointing to heaven, all pointing the listener to heaven. So these cathedrals were tremendous works of order and organization. They were an attempt to bring God to the people of the cities, to make sure they're not left out. And when you stepped into a cathedral, in a very real sense, you entered a new world. And this was part of the great accomplishment of Gothic Europe, Europe of the High Middle Ages. And it was partly indicated a new attitude, an attitude of optimism, of adventure, but an attitude where they could see life as a quest, and the cathedrals were a big part of that.